On behalf of all of us here at Bramisol, I would like to welcome everyone to today's webinar, Revenue Recognition Decoded. This is part one of a multi-part series around revenue recognition and how revenue recognition impacts your business. Today, we will be focusing on the basics, myths, and benefits of revenue recognition. Next slide. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Chris Ritterhern is the Director for Solution Architecture with over 30 years of business systems experience. Hans Christian Metz is a Senior Lead Consultant and Architect with over 15 years of SAP accounting experience. Both Chris and Hans are former Platinum Consultants at SAP. Throughout the duration of the webinar, everyone will be muted. If you have any questions, please submit them using the questions box. Questions will be answered at the end of the webinar. This webinar is being recorded and will be available for viewing shortly after its completion. The slides from today's webinar are available now and are located under the handout section. Lastly, a short survey will be sent out after the webinar, and we encourage everyone to provide feedback. I would like to now turn over the webinar to our first speaker, Chris Ritterhern. Chris?
Thank you, Larry. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for attending our webinar this morning. What I'd like to do is talk about, we're going to be spending the next 40 to 45 minutes talking about revenue recognition. And here are some of the things that we hope that you will learn from our session today. One, what is changing and why? What are the myths surrounding revenue recognition and the new regulations that are coming? And the benefits to your company of these new regulations. So something to keep in mind as we go through this is the new revenue accounting regulations are definitely coming. They have been working at it for quite some time. We'll talk about the genesis of that in just a moment. But we see that the challenge for your company is getting ready for it now versus a do-it-later approach. Because this is a fundamental change in the business process reporting of deferred revenue, we find that when you get started, taking an approach that is holistic and iterative is the best approach as you go through this. So the important thing in your mind is we suggest that you go on and get something going now. Don't worry about trying to solve the world, so to speak. Take some of your business processes, look at those, and use those as an example to get started and see at least what it looks like. So one of the things is, let's talk about some basic definitions. What is revenue recognition? Revenue is recognized when the customer obtains control of a good or service. A customer obtains control when they have the ability to direct the use and or obtain the benefits from the goods or service. And speaking about the regulations, what we really wanted to talk to you about also is how they actually will affect revenue accounting and also the industry segments impacted. So as we talk about revenue recognition, we'll be talking specifically about, is your industry impacted? What level of impacts are we typically seeing out there? And then also we're going to take some brief look at what it looks like to actually deploy revenue accounting. We'll show an example using the SAP software. So you can say, okay, look, here's an operational contract, and here's what it would potentially look at. We just did a few examples of that. In our other webinars, we'll actually be doing some live presentations in software so you can see what it looks like from that perspective. So why is there so much noise around revenue recognition? Well, one of the best people I think to ask at this point is our lead consultant, Hans Christian. He's been out there doing the deed, working with these clients on a day-to-day basis. And Hans, why do you think there is such a big discussion regarding the upcoming standard change?
Well, I think there's two different aspects to that. One is that there are small changes and there are big changes. So small changes, for instance, well, maybe changing a depreciation key for an asset or something like that. That is small. That only involves a limited number of accountants, changes a few numbers, but by and large, your process and everything stay the way they are. And then there are big changes, or changes that impact your whole organization. and that also impact very important pieces or parts of your organization, of your business processes. Those big changes, for instance, Sarbanes-Oxley was one of the big ones and still impacting you, I'm sure. And the other one would be revenue recognition as a good example. So this is not only, and we're going to go into that more detail as we go, this is not only an accounting question, but it is also a business process question, and it impacts one of the most important pieces of your organization, your revenue, your lifeblood, your cash in. So it's a big change. And I think the second aspect of that is that there are changes that are optional, or where you can basically work your way around and you can maybe fulfill the requirements in coordination with your auditors in a different way, or you can find a way to not get too involved and not to change too much for fulfilling them. But this change here is mandatory. So we're going to talk later on about specifically the ideas the guidelines contain, and they are basically a part of a strategy to harmonize revenue accounting, the recognition of revenue. And they are mandatory, so you cannot wheedle your way around them. You have to basically follow the 5-step model we're going to talk about later, and you have to comply with it. Otherwise, you're out of compliance and you will get into trouble, specifically, obviously, if you are stock market quoted. So I think, yeah, so the main takeaway is it's a major change and it's a mandatory change.
So, Munwright Luander, what is the genesis of this? Well, we've seen the Revenue Recognition Standard Guidelines being reviewed from way back in 2002. It's a long and thorough process that is finally coming to conclusion. To give you an idea of how far back this goes, 2002 is when deliberations began. There was a discussion paper issued, and some of you may be very aware of this through your normal associations and accounting organizations you belong to. 2010, 11, 12, things really started moving along much faster as they started getting exposure to what the potential regulations were going to look like and how they're going to be brought about. One of the reasons for why the regulations is, until this standard is actually in work and in process and applied out there, the current standard is revenue accounting can be reported in a variety of different ways, and it varies between U.S. GAAP and IFRS. It varies between industry, and it varies by product. So literally, there are many hundreds of different ways of recognizing deferred revenue. Given this potential or this Tower of Babel or inability to clearly see what a company's deferred revenue situation is, they opted to clean it up with one standard, and that's what we're talking about today. So 2014, they've got things pretty much together. 2017 is when they expected to start having companies deployed, but as of this year, they opted to delay it another year. So by 2018-19, your company will need to be in compliance with the new deferred revenue standards. 18 for public companies, 19 for private companies. And that's currently the standing the way it is. So that's for you to keep in mind. That's your timer. But again, what we're talking about is, since this represents a fundamental change in deferred revenue reporting, it's better to get that paradigm introduced and starting in on that now. Let's talk a little bit more about the deployment of the details of this revenue accounting standard so you get a sense of its pervasiveness. Hans, considering the new standard, what are these 5 steps that we've been hearing about?
Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
So the 5 steps is basically a unified mandatory framework to arrive at the correct legally required revenue recognition. And these 5 steps are basically, well, they vary in how difficult they are to achieve for individual customers. So in some cases, in most cases, I think that we have seen the identification of a contract with the customer is rather straightforward. You might have more complex situations around, for instance, leasing and so on, but there are solutions for that as well. But by and large, that might not be the most difficult step to complete. Then the next step is to identify separate performance obligations, and we're going to talk more about those. So the idea here is that we have to say, well, what is it that we actually have to provide to the customer as a good or a service in order to be allowed to recognize revenue when we have provided that piece of our arrangement, of our agreement. Then the next step is to determine the transaction price that will probably also not be a bigger problem, because that typically means simply what you're billing. But even that might be complicated. There might even be specific questions around that, for instance, fair market value if it's a longer-term contract, or similar questions. The fourth step is allocate the transaction price to the separate performance obligations. So that's basically the question, well, so how much revenue can I recognize for individual POBs, individual performance obligations? The question behind that is partially simply, you might have, for instance, as a simple example, you might have freebies, right? So you actually give something that you don't bill the customer for, but it does have a value. It costs you money to provide that, but you give it away as a freebie. So in that case, well, when you provide that freebie, you should be allowed to recognize revenue. So that is a typical example. So that is the calculation of that, basically of the amount that's been recognized for each performance obligation. And then the last step is, well, the moment you satisfy the performance obligation. So the question is, how are you doing that? Event-based, time-based, different ways. We're going to talk about that. Then you can recognize revenue. Yeah, and the most important thing to keep in mind here is that SAP software is following this framework, right? Absolutely. So SAP is doing exactly these 5 steps, and the whole software is basically built around this step approach. And yeah, it is the 5-step framework that you will have to follow too, one way or another. Back to you, Chris.
Very good. So the next few slides, we'd like to talk about the impact on the various industries, how the 5 steps are modeled from a high-level sort of generic discussion, and then actually show you a couple examples of what it looks like for the 5 steps to be actually modeled and deployed within a system. We talk about the impacts to the industries, and we put together a slide here so you get an idea. If I'm a cash and carry type company, deferred revenue isn't in my genre of having to deal with it. So retail typically is not having to be concerned with the new revenue accounting standards. However, as I move through the spectrum of companies, be it telecommunications or utilities or wholesale, or anybody who does project-based work. So for example, my company does make-to-order, where I take a down payment, or I do projects where I provide some services and have milestone billing. Clearly, you're going to be impacted by this. Or if I'm doing something like I'm selling and I have an example of this, I'm selling a media device that plugs into the TV. Well, when you buy the device, you are automatically given 6 months of monthly subscription as part of it, and then thereafter you can decide what you want to do. That's a deferred revenue scenario, and we'll show you an example of what that looks like in this new paradigm, just to pick one. In our other upcoming sessions, when we do the live scenario, we're going to pick about 3 or 4 typical business scenarios we see. And if you happen to think of one or have one that you'd like to see us put in that webinar, not that we're going to promise we can get all of them, do please send your comments along, and we'll certainly take that into consideration. So one of the things that you heard mentioned in this thing is a performance obligation. So what is a POB? Under the new regulations, a performance obligation is defined as a promise to transfer good or service. It's something that can be explicitly stated in the contract or can be implied. Okay, I did use the word in its own definition. For example, implied in customary business practices or published policies outside of the contract, activities undertaken to fulfill a contract, they're not necessarily considered a performance obligation unless these activities transfer a good or service to the customer. So if you're doing something, even if it's implied, these are considered a performance obligation. The example of when they buy my media box, I give them 6 months subscription as part of that media box. So that's deferred revenue, and now comes under the jurisdiction of the new revenue accounting standards. One thing that's nice, though, is SAP in particular has opted to take the approach of we're going to write an application add-on to our SAP customers and non-SAP customers can take advantage of that complies fully with both the IFRS and the US GAAP standards. So if I were to use that particular module, no matter what I do, I'm automatically in compliance with both standards out there between IFRS and GAAP. So there is a good thing to keep in mind that in the software world, there's a solution, and the solution is mindful of both regulations. Well, we talked about the 5 steps, just to give you an idea of what it looks like. How does a sales service contract break down, or any type of a deferred revenue accounting contract? Well, here's an example, basically following the 5-step model. Consider the premise is one way to comply with the new FASB regulations is through the use of essentially a mirror contract, which is what SAP has done. So in SAP's revenue accounting module, they create what's called a mirror contract, or the revenue accounting contract, and this contains the specific performance obligations as related to the regulations. So that all I need to do is do my normal activities. It gets integrated in with the revenue accounting module, and it is complying with the regulations. Now, therein also lies some other interesting aspects that I have that capability. In this example, you can see that a revenue accounting contract can have combinations of contracts if it's the same customer or something like that combined into it. The next thing that comes into play is identifying the separate performance obligations and the standalone selling prices. These are all terminology and components of the new regulation, and it corresponds usually to an item of an operational contract, or you kind of think about it, it's the sales bill of material. And you can see here on the left, bottom left of the screen, I have my sales bill of material. I got a smartphone. It comes the smartphone and the battery charger. But that also infers an upgrade right. So I also get into the concepts of a leading POB. Hans, can you briefly describe what is a leading POB?
Yes, so a leading POB is basically a POB that drives the creation and the fulfillment, and also some other data, for instance, durations of another POB. So the example here is that we have a smartphone pack, and when the customer buys that, they automatically get the right to upgrade to the latest release if that happens within, for instance, the duration of the contract, so maybe 2 years. Now, that upgrade right is not, for instance, in this example, in the BOM, right? So it is not part of the parts that you deliver, that you have manufactured, put together, and delivered. And it is also not necessarily specifically mentioned on a sales order, but it is a right that you have given the customer in a contract, and that is a right that has, well, by itself, not its own really, it doesn't stand on its own, because it's only related to the smartphone pack. So the leading POB in this is basically the smartphone pack, and the upgrade right is kind of, if you will, the following POB.
Very good. Now, what about the last step? Now, I did skip step 3 and 4 in the interest of time, but I just wanted to point out that in performance obligations, there is the concept of event-based and time-based. Event-based is that a good or something that is done and then delivered, and it's delivered at a later date, and that's the point at which I can recognize the revenue. Up until that point, it was unplanned revenue or deferred revenue. So if somebody signs a contract with me, I need to provide them something, but I'm not giving that to them right away. So it shows up in my overall sales revenue as deferred revenue until I actually issue the item, and that's event-based. For example, projects with milestone billing or milestones and maybe related billing, the milestones are event-based. But I also at the same time can have performance obligations that are time-based. And these are as simple as somebody pays me a year in advance and I recognize that revenue over a monthly basis, that's time-based. Or the other side of the scenario is I bill somebody monthly for a subscription, that's still time-based, it's a year subscription that I'm billing them for even though I don't have the money in advance. Or in the example that I'm just about to show you, the scenario is there's something included with the delivery of goods. So let's take a look at what this looks like. So if I look at an enterprise core sales contract, this is just an example of a sales contract. Does it have to come from there? No. Can you use the revenue accounting engine, revenue accounting software as an engine? Yes, meaning you can take external feeds from other software systems. In this very simple scenario, I've got a media device that I'm selling for $199, and it includes the first 6 months of service with the unit. So this is what the contract looks like in the transaction system. If I go a little bit further now, I see something very different in terms of how this looks in the revenue accounting system. So now this has been transferred into the revenue accounting system. And notice that I've got 7 line items there. Now in the sales order, I had 2. But now I've got 7 because each one of those line items is a performance obligation, the monthly subscription plus the device itself. And if you can look here, because I've delivered the device, we see my revenue and the incantation or the rules upon which how much revenue I recognize is something that you set as part of an implementation. In other words, it's we take a portion of the revenue and it's recognized monthly, and the other portions are recognized in other buckets. We take a portion of our actual item, and that's recognized as revenue, and the other portion is allocated across the monthly subscription and deferred through that way. So just understand there are rules that are applied, and you can take a look at how that is accomplished in the system. And I look at the revenue accounting module, what I can see is I can look really quickly here, and I can see the actual fulfillment type here. Notice the method to be recognized. It's time-based or events-based. And I can actually see something has happened. Goods were issued. So I have easy visibility into what's been going on in the system and what's happening. When I come into this kind of a system now, I have the ability to look at different buckets of money. You can see here on the top left, you have recognized revenue, posted, planned, unscheduled, total revenue, fulfillment progress. So all these are components of the new regulation, and as a result, I have insight into these, and we'll talk a bit about more of those in a bit. And then finally, when I update back into my financial system, the revenue accounting module automatically makes all the adjustments. I know this is a bit busy here, and if somebody's busy here trying to add this all up, it does add up correctly. These are all the automatic adjustments that are made from the revenue accounting module back into my financial system so that my ultimate end financials are reported correctly. In other words, sales revenue is sales revenue, and deferred revenue is, in fact, deferred revenue. And I actually can go further on deferred revenue if I were to drill down and take a look at what is my unplanned revenue schedule out there based on what I see. I can also take a look at just a graphical view of this. So when I have these kind of systems now, I can say, okay, what's my revenue schedule and revenue picture look like for the media device and the monthly description going over time. And you can see the blue bar means I saw that right away in period 1 because I delivered the device. But then thereafter, I have smaller amounts of revenue across the months as they occur in a time-based recognition scenario. So what we just saw was a sales contract with a delivered item and 1 month of subscription recognized. That included a monthly billing plan, and that's just a term or a convention for the 6 months. So just to give you an example of how this operates and what it looks like when you start to put it into a software system. Okay, so how do I get success? How do I get there? We've put it together in 3 simple steps for revenue recognition success. 1, know what is changing and why. 2, keep the myths away about revenue recognition. And utilize the potential of this new regulation and execute on the benefits. Now let's talk a little bit more about what that means. 1, know what is changing and why. Hans, let me ask you this. So based on your experience out there helping companies implement this and comply with the new standard, what are the few key aspects you see at the start of a project?
Yeah, so obviously this varies also between companies and between sectors, right? But I think there's some main aspects to keep in mind. So for one, you really have to understand your own business in the terms of the new guidelines. So you have to think through your business processes. You have to detail scenarios to cover your business in the way that the guidelines require that. And that is actually kind of agnostic about what software you're using, but in any case, I've already told you that the revenue recognition module requires you to follow those steps and expects information for fulfilling those different steps. So you have to detail the scenarios to cover your business, obviously by volume, by value, depending on if you really can cover or need to cover all the scenarios. And then maybe another aspect to that is that there's really an iterative process which involves a number of players, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later, right? And also maybe another aspect of this is that you will possibly have to change, or you will have to think about handling your business processes going forward. It is not only a reporting question, it is way more than that. So I think that's probably the key aspects here.
Thank you, Hans. And just a reminder, what is revenue recognition? I think you're starting to get a sense of what is revenue recognition with respect to the new guidelines and what that means. So as we talk more about what that is, what is changing and why? It's a change in the conception of revenue realization, cost recognition in context of the contractual relation, and also taking in mind the collectability of the revenue. And why is this? Well, because I talked about earlier, there were very big discrepancies between IFRS and US GAAP, and they really wanted to bring that together. And the discrepancies weren't just between the two accounting organizations. They varied by industry and they varied by product category. So if somebody was looking at the books of one company and trying to get a sense of their total revenue picture, and they looked at the books of another company in a different industry, and they both had deferred contracts, they wouldn't necessarily get a uniform picture so they could do an apples-to-apples comparison. So with the new regulations, that now starts to go by the boards. Very important now to keep the myths away about revenue recognition. And let's talk about a few of those myths. We're not talking about the myth of the unicorn. And if anybody's seen a unicorn out there, please raise your hand, and we'll be more than happy to talk to you about that. But we hear a lot of myths and a lot of things going on there as regards to revenue recognition. Myth one, for example, is this is only for finance. Not true. Its implications for sales, operations, marketing, and human resources. The underlying impacts and inefficiency of the revenue recognition today that are already baked into the current processes, and we've seen all kinds of interesting processes that go from homegrown systems to using partial functionality available in existing software systems to spreadsheets. We've seen a lot of varieties out there in terms of that. Hans, why do you see this as not only for finance?
Yeah, so we have already mentioned a little bit, I've hinted at that in the key aspects. So it's an iterative process that really involves numerous players in the organization. It will obviously involve the revenue management and the revenue accountants. So those are basically the people that you have to start off with. They have to also congregate with the auditors, to really find out what are the changes that impact me, right? You will have to also have general accountants, because there will be additional accounts, there will be changes in your account structure that will have impact on your reporting, right? You will have IT involved, obviously, because it is a separate module. Currently, it is still somewhat treated separately from the core ERP product. That is because of the release schedules. So that by itself is already, we have found to be a challenge. It is not directly doable if you only look at the administrative guides and so on. So it takes some experience and some knowledge how to do that, but it involves your IT department big time. We also obviously have program or project management aspects of that, and then last but not least, you have sales, right? Sales operations. So things that you're doing right now, maybe they have, like Chris already mentioned, maybe they have been skewed, they have been done in a way that you were able to work with them for your old revenue recognition. Now with the new standards, that might mean that you have to change those processes. So it's not only finance, for sure.
Very good. Thank you, Hans. Number two, it really only applies to software companies. Wouldn't that be nice? Then it wouldn't be my issue if I wasn't a software company. But unfortunately, that's not correct. The goal of this was to introduce uniformity and predictability to revenue recognition practices globally across all companies and across all industries, and to make sure that there was a clear evaluation and implementation plan to be able to see that. So it's not just software companies, it's all companies that are affected. Myth number three that we hear out there, it's a long, long way, so I don't need to worry. Well, you know, in today's world, we see versions of software changing weekly or daily. We see updates happening quite fast. We see people saying, well, on my phone, why isn't there an app for that I can use right now to do this thing that I'm doing? But in this case, time is not your friend. Early adoption is really key, and it has to do with the change management aspects of it. We recognize the new regulations, and what we're seeing out there is that it does inject a level of new change and new practices within a company, between looking at what your current revenue, your business processes is as regards to a deferred revenue scenario, and the impact that it has to your organization. And the sooner you get that change management structure in place and people adjusted to the new way of how you report deferred revenue, and also from the perspective of reporting. In other words, when I go to say, what is my deferred revenue scenario, my deferred revenue, I've got a very clear set way that everybody's going to be reporting on, so that as I show my numbers, either public or on private, they make sense, or if I'm in different meetings presenting my P&L, it makes a clear sense of what the P&L is and exactly where the numbers are coming from. In our experience, we see companies getting started now due to the impact of these many aspects and to allow time for the departments to understand the impact. Step 3, utilize the potential. So away from the myths now and utilize the potential, execute the benefits. Let's talk about a few of these benefits. For key stakeholders, it's insights into the impact of deferred revenue. So you saw in that simple scenario where I showed a slide that showed different kinds of revenue, that I can easily see, okay, here's my unplanned revenue, here's my posted revenue, here's my invoiced revenue, and I could see the different kinds of revenue, so I knew exactly what my cash pipeline looked like, so to speak, or my revenue pipeline. And also I could see a percentage of what was executed. So the 200,000 that I'm eventually collecting, I see that we're 62% into that, so that I know that I can count on the other percentage, given that we do all the things that we're doing as regards to the deferred or the contract. It's better transparency into the requirements of your deferred revenue scenario. So I gain much clearer transparency, and I get real good alignment because it's a set 5-step process. It's always the 5-step process. It's not like a 1-step or a 2.5 or 1, 4, and 5. It's always a 5-step process. For IT managers and the technical teams on the infrastructure side, again, they get insights into the impact. They see what's going on. They see the process. They know it's 5 steps. And in some cases, if they're going to be a common platform with a known solution, we're talking about SAP in this instance. The solution benefits utilizing the new SAP revenue accounting and reporting capability are a few listed here to give you a sense of what's happening out there. And do keep in mind, what's in it for me is very key here. You know, we need to always keep in mind what's in it for me. When you're doing this with your company or departments, we always want to phrase it in terms of what is the benefit, how is it going to clean it up. And as Hans was saying earlier, it is a regulation. You will have to comply. So you do want to state what's in it for me is I don't go to the Brave Bar Motel. But what's in it for me is I get a better, cleaner view into what's going on overall. Visibility into the revenue, contracts, and exposure of that. Better ability to analyze profitability by that set standalone selling price, even though it's a number that is a deferred number. Better look and view of contract summary across all the deferred revenue scenario makes it much simpler from an audit perspective. Being able to leverage contracts and the accounting policies and market that data potentially. And also in lease scenarios, being able to have a unified collection of my lease contract data, because lease certainly is a very good form, a very classic example of deferred revenue. So do keep these benefits in mind as you move through it. But one of the other things that we find that's very key is the user experience. Nowadays, when somebody says, "What's an app for that?" or "Why is that?" User experience is very key. And what SAP did, and I'm just giving you a little preview of our next webinar, they used their software to closely follow those 5 steps, while at the same time keeping the user experience keen in terms of how they interact with the people that are going to be working with this software. So you can see there's the 5 steps. There's software screens by each one of those. So I can almost say, what step am I at? Great. I can go exactly and see what's happening there in the software and follow the exact standard in the regulations. And that's both IFRS and GAAP. So we talk about getting started. What does that mean exactly, getting started? Well, we really suggest don't wait. Learn the new accounting standards now. There's lots of white papers and ebooks out there. Our website, we've got quite a few. Today's slides are in the handout box. You can actually download those now. It has a web link to our site where you can read all kinds of interesting information about the new standards. Don't be last minute. Last minute means increased cost and problems and potential non-compliance. Non-compliance means that you get to, if you're a public company, put a footnote in your financials saying we're reporting under the old standards. And I know everybody loves to have that footnotes in their financial reports that they put out to the public. And your key to success is now. And one of the things about we say we get started is, this is where we've really been a champion of this. When Graphical comes in, we really suggest let's get a mini POC started now, a little mini proof of concept. Let's say, for example, gee, we kind of looked through it. We know we have about a dozen deferred revenue, sales, service, contract scenarios. We'll come in there and say, hey, look, let's just take 1 or 2 or 3 and just model them up just based on verbal workshop discussions and just model it up to see what it looks like in the new software, and then take that learning and say, okay, let's stop that now. Okay, good. Now let's look at what that means from really the perspective of implementing all the processes. So you just do a few, you get some learning going there. It's a very quick learning curve, which is why we really push on these proof of concepts. And in fact, we've architected it so well now, we've done this enough that we actually will provide you a system to do the proof of concept against. We have a system that's already up there in the cloud that we can create a copy that's custom for you. And then you can use that while your IT decides if they're going to deploy the software or whatever, so that you can start to, from a finance-led perspective, and the rest of the sales and operations folks involved, they can actually get their hands around it, look at how to operate, say, oh, this is what a contract's going to look like, and this is how I'm now going to have to report my sales revenue from the perspective of these new regulations. So with that, I think we're running pretty much on time, and we can now we'll be able to take some questions.
Thank you, Chris. This concludes the presentation section of our webinar, and we are now open for questions. If you have a question, please enter it in the questions box.